Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Tarun Khanna from the Harvard Business School, and it's a distinct pleasure to be in this alien territory. It's an even more of a pleasure for me to be able to introduce a friend, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, and I'm just going to take just a couple of minutes to give those of us who don't know much about his background a brief flavor of what this amazing individual has accomplished in just a couple of decades. Anwar joined politics, so to speak, in the early 1980s, and as a minister for youth, and later assumed a number of increasingly important positions in the Malaysian government, serving, among other things, as Minister of Education, Minister of Finance, and was also elected President of the UNESCO General Conference pretty early on. In '93, he was appointed Deputy Prime Minister and widely seen as on a really rapidly ascending political trajectory. A number of awards at this time came Anwar's direction, and many of these are familiar to those who followed this gentleman's career over the years. I'll just give you a smattering of them because they're too numerous to really list. He was named Finance Minister of the Year by Asia Money, was given the Presidential Medal by Georgetown University, a number of honorary doctorates, elected Chairman of the Development Committee of the IMF World Bank, and finally in '98 named Newsweek International Asian of the Year, which is a singular honor that really spans a number of fields of endeavor. So it's really more than a political honor, so to speak. And then he was sacked from the government in 1998 in a dramatic reversal of fortunes, so to speak, stripped of his party membership and incarcerated on various charges that I won't go into. And finally regained his freedom after an amazing odyssey of roughly 6 years, and was acquitted by the Malaysian Federal Court in September of 2004. So a full 6 years of a fairly trying experience, a very trying experience, which I can't even begin to imagine. Currently, Anwar is emerging as a face of moderate Islam around the world and is fulfilling various commitments, wandering around the world, giving speeches and so on issues which I think he's going to touch on today. And he's a wonderful, charismatic speaker. We're really lucky to have him. On Islam, democracy, moderate Islam, taking pains to distinguish what Islam really means in Southeast Asia, South Asia, as distinct from what it means in some other parts of the world, for instance, the Middle East. He's written a number of columns and articles, places that I'm sure you've encountered, the standard media outlets, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Davos Man, so to speak, as my colleague Sam Huntington would say. Really all about these issues of moderation and the direction of Islam, the future of reform, the role that religion plays in life in general, etc. Currently, he is Distinguished Visiting Fellow. He was Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Johns Hopkins and is now visiting at Georgetown teaching a course. And I'm told he's leaving here at 5 a.m. to go straight to his lecture hall, and also visiting St. Anthony's College at Oxford. He's really an extraordinary man, an important statesman, not only in Malaysia, but also in Southeast Asia, somebody who's seen the political side, the rough and tumble of political life, the rough and tumble of the business side of things, so to speak, and has gone through a personal odyssey, which is why I think it makes him triply interesting, so to speak. So please join me in welcoming Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim.
Thank you, Mr. Tarun, for these very kind remarks. I'm thinking of returning to Malaysia and continue my political battle. I would certainly seek his services to try and give such an impressive introduction, and I'm sure many Malaysians will be very impressed. Thank you, Tarun. Now, the issue of the challenges of Islam and democracy. We need to ask, what necessitates such a discourse on Islam and democracy? Islam is clearly misunderstood, perceived as an adversary, because it is also seen as a religion, as an ideology that tend to reject the generally accepted notion of Western value system, It is perceived here in the West, in the context of post 9/11, as a security and terrorist threat, and is also seen as a monolith stretching from Morocco to Indonesia. Now, democracy, clearly the failure of governments, Muslim governments, to respect basic freedom in their countries. There is democracy deficit in the Muslim world. But viewed from a historical perspective, you have seen Baghdad for 700 years, Andalusia, centuries of enlightened civilization, and in the recent post-colonial context, Iraq was a relatively prosperous and democratic country until hijacked by the military dictatorship. And under Saddam Hussein, prior to the American occupation, Iraq's GDP in real terms was lower than what it was 40 years earlier. Iran, for example, had democratic elections, but the United States toppled Mossaddeq's government and installed the Shah. Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, had free and fair elections in 1955 under Sukarno, under President Sukarno, and installed Muhammad Nasir of the Muslim Party as a prime minister. But again, the secular nationalist Sukarno suspended the constitution and declared guided democracy with himself as the supreme leader, supreme commander, conscience of the Indonesian people, etc., etc. In Turkey and Pakistan, aspirations for democracy or true political participation were under constant threat from the military. What were the forces that are aggregating to the failure to this democratic experiment? I have given historical antecedents that democracy is not something unfamiliar to the Muslim world. So the issue of whether Islam is compatible to democracy or development is quite irrelevant if you understand the history of Muslim societies. In fact, in what we term as the maqasid of Sharia, Sharia is a taboo in the Western context. At the moment, in many of my exchanges, immediately they ask, what about the Sharia? What about the application of Sharia? Let me put it this way. The maqasid of Sharia, which means the aim of Sharia rule, notwithstanding our personal or collective view what Sharia entails or whether we agree with Islamic rule or not. The maqasid, or the aim of Islamic rule in the traditional classical sense, is the protection, the guarantee of freedom of conscience, expression, life, property, and honor. It sounds Jeffersonian to my mind, but that's the fact. Now, whether it is so as understood by many Muslims, perceive or believe is another issue, which we'll have to deal with. Therefore, it is exasperating for me as a Muslim to have to deal with the subject, because, and to conduct this continuous discourse, because Muslims seem to be hibernating in a self-imposed winter of benign resignation. First, on the issue of fundamental principle of the rule of law or governance, which we'll have to grapple with. A basic question on whether we would have a constitution that would guarantee freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and the rule of law. Unfortunately, this is not resolved in most Muslim countries. And why did I say that I feel exasperated? Because in developed countries, we are talking about stakeholder capitalism, IT-empowered investment, improving governance. And the Muslim world has to confront the basic issue of governance, the rule of law, corruption. And you look at the world economic indicators, the poorest, sub-Saharan Africa happens to be, almost without exception, Muslim countries. Taiwan in the 60s was quite in the same economic position or situation as compared to Egypt. Taiwan has propelled its growth, phenomenal rate of growth. Egypt, I will leave it there. And but as I have emphasized, that Islam, not only from the view of a maqasid, or of the aim of Sharia, but the historical antecedents, developed in a largely Judeo-Christian environment with Jewish and Christian scholars actively participating in the transmission of Greek thought in Arabic. In Andalusia, we talk of convivencia of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We have produced Ibn Rushd and Musa ibn Maimun, the Jews, known to the Jews as Maimonides. Ibn Rushd is Averroes, which is of course not the case for the present. So we have to grapple now, not confined to the war on terror, but the war of ideas. The parameters and coordinate of this larger battlefield are not easy to define, as there is considerable overlapping. Modernity and democracy, fundamentalism and autocracy. And crisscrossing these two issues or fronts is the issue of liberty, freedom, and socio-economic progress. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Muslim governments are entirely to be blamed for the excesses or poverty, but I believe that their conduct and misrule is to a large extent the cause for the present malaise of the Muslims. Yes, admittedly, and you, the Harvard Business School, are more familiar than me on this. I've never been trained as an economist. I happened to be made the finance minister because I was not trained as an economist, that's why I was sacked. But there were, of course, unfair trading practices. But the enormous disincentives or domestic inhibitors is due to enduring authoritarianism, inefficiency, bureaucratic encumbrances, massive corruption, and this due to these decades of misrule, we have subjective perceptions of risk. They are not able to attract foreign direct investments. Taiwan, as I alluded to earlier, was able to invite and attract the diaspora of Taiwanese back to Taiwan. Not in the case of the Muslim world, certainly not the Arabs, not the Pakistanis, because the issue of governance is yet to be resolved. Now, I'm not therefore suggesting, although I've been accused as a pro-World Bank and IMF in the prescriptions. I do intend to deal with it. It's not directly relevant, but I'm just suggesting that the discourse is not only confined to the issue of Islam and democracy. In Asia, it is between Asian values and democracy and freedom. Asian values as articulated by people like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore and my old friend Dr. Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia. I bet you wouldn't call him a friend if you got exalted as I did, but still. But the whole philosophy is, of course, condescending. It's against the principle of liberty and democracy. Is that leaders know best. That the issue of peace, security, and economic development should be given not only prominence, but the determinant. And other issues should be relegated to the background. I would even, as a moderate, would say that, all right, give first few years. But they continue with impunity in some cases, with these draconian measures for decades. What is worrying? I think if you read Amartya Sen's Freedom Development, I think this whole notion of Asian values has been effectively debunked by him. So I don't intend to proceed on this argument, but to suggest that when Sun Yat-sen to Tunku Abdul Rahman, or even Sukarno for that matter, Nasser in Egypt, all the great nationalist heroes of Jinnah in Pakistan, when they were struggling for independence, all of them talk about the rule of law, free media, free and fair elections. It's not the dictate of Washington necessarily. And certainly I'm not in favor of enforcing or compelling countries and societies to adopt democracy and freedom at the barrel of M16 or bombs, like in Iraq. And I think if at all we want to consider a practical and viable option for democracy, it should be as practiced in Turkey and in Indonesia. Indonesia now is the largest Muslim country in the world. But the problem here, no, not here, not in this school, you understand better. I'm talking Washington. Is to see Islam in the prism of the Arab experience. Clearly contentious, explosive, no democracy, and deplorable state of affairs. But you should also be able to, be prepared to see Islam in the prism in Southeast Asia. And South Asia, to an extent, from its unique experience. It's Malaysia, as an example, has always been a multiracial, multi-religious country. Indonesia, although Muslims comprise 95% of the population, but from the beginning, the fathers and mothers struggling for independence made it very clear. It's a modern, democratic state. Not many countries opt to use this term secular, because secularism connotes differently to Muslim societies, as not only separation of religion and state, but secularism in many Muslim countries becomes a weapon for the secularists who are anti-religion, as you see, for example, in the case of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. That's why there is this backlash and reaction against secularism, because as understood and perceived in the Muslim world, secularism is anti-religion. Not only it is independent of religion. So the polemics and discourse on secularism in the Muslim world is quite starkly different from the experience in the West, in Europe and the United States. But in Indonesia, to my mind, from the elections that I alluded to earlier in 1955, the issue of elections, the issue during the elections, the agenda for the Muslim parties has always been a multicultural, multi-religious Indonesia, although Muslims were 95% of the population. Even the so-called Islamists did not propound that clearly, the issue of application of the Sharia or Islamic State or application of Islamic laws. They, of course, promote the understanding of Islam as a way of life, tolerance of religion, and wanting Muslims to be able to practice their belief system. And the positive news is, unlike the, again, before that, India, of course, Muslims are a minority, but a substantial minority. It's 100 million. Yeah. And they participate in the democratic process. You don't have, for example, a rejection. In fact, Indian Muslims vastly, on the whole, support the democratic process. So the issue of compatibility, again, is irrelevant. And you have, of course, extremists in any religion, among the Hindus in India and the Muslims in India, I believe. I have a friend who met me recently in Delhi and was asking for my view. He said, Anwar, I think we need to set up an Islamic party in India. I said, well, why do you feel necessary? He said, we must be able to project and expose the Indians to the Indians and the Hindus, but the whole idea of Islamic government. So I told him, I said, why don't you concentrate on becoming a good academic, on discouraging him from being a politician? Because you have, of course, you'll find from time to time some views in this direction. But on the whole, the vast majority of Indians, of Malaysians, of Indonesians, they comprise not only a substantial majority, but clearly 3/4 of the Muslim population in Bangladesh, inclusive, opt for a moderate Islam and believe in a democratic process. And Indonesia and Malaysia at one time, you know, the World Bank report in the 1990s, together with the East Asian economies, were regarded as, the South Asian countries, East Asian economies, were termed as East Asian economic miracle. This report by the World Bank, to my mind, did not do a service to Malaysia or the country, because then the leaders became a bit arrogant and thought that what they did were right. And I was probably the only Minister of Finance in that region that cautioned the World Bank that this report is really a disservice to us, because while some of the fundamentals may be right, but there is abject poverty, even in China or Malaysia or Indonesia. There are areas where there is comfortable or phenomenal growth, but there's still large section, the vast majority, are still being marginalized. The issue of abject poverty, the issue of corruption, the issue of governance and empowerment. But as you know, the Paradiso alluded to in this period of economic growth soon became an inferno. And that was the crisis 1997-98. But for Malaysia and Indonesia, although I would say that relative to the state of affairs in other Muslim countries, was rather successful. But we have to be honest to recognize that other than the issue of stability and governance is also the role of the industrious Chinese that were not only industrious but were catalytic in ensuring a successful economy. So I am, of course, a firm believer in free market philosophy, in the role of business as a catalyst for economic reform. Free markets, to my mind, will unleash the forces of supply and demand. So when I talk about Islam, democracy, the issue of freedom, it also includes the issue of market economy. And of course, sure, when here, over the years, we have seen enough corporate scandals brought about by the breakdown of corporate governance, but we also see a great demand for transparency and ethical practices. Corporate social responsibility should not just be an MBA course, but for active determination to see that rogue corporations stop colluding with political leaders and autocrats, that human development, environment, and justice, elevating poverty should also be a major consideration. Now, the challenge, therefore, is for the Muslim world to actualize these ideals. That Islam and the challenge to the Muslims to ensure that we manage our affairs responsibly. Because one can claim to be a moderate Muslim or a Muslim state. It's not relevant to me. Because how can we talk of an Islamic society or moderate Islam without the freedom of conscience, speech, right to property, or with arbitrary arrest? Where the rule of men prevails over the rule of law. And we can't, nowadays, even Washington, which are quite responsible in promoting many of the autocrats and dictators in the past, have now admitted that this would have to discontinue, at least in their pronouncements, but we have not seen any change in terms of their policies. In fact, they have been given further legitimacy to these so-called moderates, including in Malaysia, all called moderates, because the articulation of Islam as a classic example of circumlocution, that it lays out purportedly a central platform for modernity and reform, but circumvents the most crucial issues of governance, of corruption, or debate on freedom and justice. So, to my mind, it does not really matter what is claimed by Muslim moderates or governments, but we will have to look at the facts and indexes and assess whether it is practiced and the respect for freedom and human dignity is there in place. Because otherwise, my question would be, isn't it farcical to suggest that we are moderates without freedom, without sustainable development, without social justice and cultural empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anwar, especially for the historical perspective and the reminder that the rest of the world may not see Islam the same way that the West sees Islam. As you know, a hallmark of the forum has been the ability to ask questions, and I'm told there are 4 mics. There are 2 down here and 2 are in the glare somewhere, 2 up there. So if we could all be respectful of each other's presence and ask sharp questions, preferably ending in a question mark, and also be kind enough to introduce yourself very, very briefly. What I propose to do is simply go around the mics and direct questions. Perhaps, would you mind stepping up? And I'll just call out to...
Dr. Anwar, is this on?
Yes, it's on.
Thank you, first of all, for coming here and speaking here today. And I want to ask you a question. I'm in the ALM program at Harvard. I'd like to ask you a question as not just a Muslim, but as a student and as a human rights practitioner. And a lot of people in the West, particularly in the United States, have made a correlation between democracy and human rights. And I'd like to ask, just one step above that, what do you believe is the reason, why do you believe that there are human rights violations occurring across the board in Muslim countries, and what has to be done? Is it just a question of democracy, or is there something more to that?
There's democracy deficit in the Muslim world. There's no free media. There are lots of human rights abuse, and there's no opportunity for people to express themselves. Of course, we condemn the treatment of Iraqis in Abu Ghraib prison, and I think it is pathetic that this could have happened under American occupation. But that is not enough. What about the prisons in the Muslim world? Some of the conditions are certainly deplorable. I mean, it's not my personal example, but then I was a deputy prime minister, and the following year I was assaulted to near death. And this is I'm talking about Malaysia, which is relatively much better than many of our other colleagues elsewhere. So I think the resolve, therefore, is an international community. That is why, as you see, the universal principles of freedom, market economy, of justice and human rights is not confined to the Muslims or Christians or the Jews. I mean, it's a common resolve. And that is, I think, the fundamental issue here. We will have to articulate, and you in America have got to do more, to my mind, because whatever we may say, whatever reservations we have against the United States foreign policy in particular, under President Bush, you have the freedom here to exercise, and there's no risk. In Malaysia, yes, I have a freedom of speech, not freedom after speech.
Yeah, my name is Valerian. I'm a journalist from Africa, and I'm a mid-career student. Doctor, my question is, the rise of Islamic, or I don't want to use the term, terrorism, global terrorism, has been raising a lot of questions. And I have the impression, it's a personal opinion, I might be wrong, but I think unlike other religions, like Christianity, Islam as a religion has not evolved over time. So would it be a fair assessment to say there's something fundamentally wrong with Islam as a religion, which accounts for the democracy deficits in the Muslim world?
Thank you. Now, first on the issue of terrorism, I think we have to make it very clear. Don't give any excuse. It must be condemned unreservedly. It does not matter whether it is perpetrated by Muslims or non-Muslims. And even now, which to a large extent perpetrated by Muslims, there are a lot of research who say, look, in the numbers are 1,500 and 400 Muslims, 600 Hindus, and Tamil Tigers, whatever. But I think, to my mind, notwithstanding all this, is not relevant. The point is, it has to be condemned. And the Muslim world have to grapple with this issue. Not only the clerics, but more so the ruling clique. That's point one. Now, is the issue of the evolvement or the evolution of Muslim thought stifled creativity to the extent that the discourse on freedom and democracy has been truncated somewhat? To an extent, yes. You see, Muhammad Iqbal in Pakistan, in his Reconstruction Religious Thought, addressed this very point, that for a few hundred years, this truncated view, the denial or inability of Muslims to articulate creatively is because of the taqlid, the rule that deny them the right to express their views. And he then called upon the opening of the doors of dialogue and discourse, or ijtihad. And we are able to do that. After all, look at the vast source of knowledge. Look at the Baitul Hikmah of Baghdad those days. So if you say that it is inherent in religion, it is not right, because for the 700 years you have this mushrooming of ideas, philosophy from Aristotle to what have you. You have Al-Biruni of India, originally from Persia, but in India, writing about Hinduism, a treatise on Hinduism. You have this favorite quote from Amartya Sen of Akbar and Din Ilahi, although it's controversial, but still, you have this sort of experience throughout Muslim civilization history. But what happened the last few decades, the last 100 years? Why? Because of these tyrants and authoritarian rulers. That's why I'm determined, whatever power and influence at my disposal, to struggle and fight, not in any particular country, but to attack these authoritarian leaders and tyrants, because they are actually stifling dissent and disallowing creative thinking and even criticism to their rule. And to a large extent, though not entirely, it is because of the oppression or marginalization as a result of this misrule by these authoritarian leaders that created so much mess, confusion, and also partly inciting terrorist elements within Muslim societies. As you ask me what I learned in my 6 years in solitary confinement, I say the greatest passion for freedom. I'll speak up my mind. Whether it's tolerated or otherwise, it does not matter. Whether I have to take the risk going back to Malaysia, speak my mind, and the next day threaten with another arrest. But I will not compromise. I will not concede on this. I can forgive those rogues who assaulted me, but I will not surrender. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim, for coming here to give a talk. I'm Shenjun Ong from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. My question is, what do you think it would take to shift the US and Western perception of Islam towards, one, terrorism, and two, the dictatorial and authoritarian regimes, especially in the Arab Muslim countries? Do you think it's a lack of lobby effort on the Muslim nations on Washington to shift the perception of Islam away from these negative popular connotations?
It requires the entire strength of all the professors at Harvard to try and formulate an agenda for better understanding and civilizational dialogue. But I think whatever way we can, they need to be persuaded. Some of them, of course, sometimes, you see, I must explain here. I am not against the President Bush agenda for freedom and democracy. I'm not. In fact, I would say that I would view this positively. I mean, why not? I mean, if America abdicates that responsibility, tell me who's going to speak up? President of Pakistan? Or President of Egypt talking about democracy and freedom in the Muslim world? It will never happen. So it is okay. But you have to be consistent. And you must realize that finally, democracy can take place when the institutions of civil society are in place. It is not just free and fair elections. It is the rule of law. It's a free media. You have elections like what we experience in Malaysia, and elections in Malaysia where not 10 minutes given to the opposition to articulate their views, where the media is completely under the control of the ruling party and the government. It will not. It renders meaningless the whole issue of democracy. So the articulation or the program to promote democracy and freedom in the world is, to my mind, not only a bold initiative, but a welcome initiative. It is true to the ideals of the American Constitution, and what we say or refer to as Jeffersonian ideals, which I share completely as a Muslim, as a Malay, as a Malaysian. But it's not arrogance. It's not a condescending view. It's not by brute force. It's by reason. That's why I alluded to the war of ideas. We'll try our best. Thank you.
Your Excellency, I have a point to make, but incidentally, mine won't finish with an interrogation mark. I just wanted to inform you, I'm from Bangladesh, and when you were giving a rundown of the democratic developments in various countries of the world, I think, sir, you made an inadvertent omission on Bangladesh, where we have had democratic practices ever since its inception. And for the last 15 years, we have had both the leader of the House and the leader of the opposition women. And we are a Muslim country with predominantly Muslim population. And it's perhaps the only country in the world where the ruling government steps down, hands over power to a caretaker government headed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who conduct the election within 120 days and hands over power to the winning party. So I just wanted to inform the audience about that. Thank you.
I agree. Although I would have some reservations here. Number one, though elections were generally considered to be free and fair, and there is certainly a rule of law, but you know, we have to grapple with the issues of corruption and the issue of governance in the general terms. But I think when you talk about at least some semblance of democracy in terms of elections and rule of law, I certainly do take conclusion of that. Thank you.
Hi, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim. My name is Kelvin Teo. I'm one of the Malaysian students who's studying in MIT right now. Yeah, from your speech, I realized that you're trying to differentiate between the Asian value and Islamic value, I would say. So like now, since I'm from Malaysia, I'm more concerned about Malaysian. Like you say, there's a freedom for speech, but not freedom after speech. So my question is, how do you see this kind of issue, like the Asian value, those negative point of the Asian value can be tackled, or more specifically for us as a student who's studying overseas, what role can we play as a student to help to tackle in this kind of issue? Thank you.
Now, what do you mean by Asian values? I mean, what is being espoused by former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir is that well, you have to give complete trust and confidence to the leaders. Now, my point is the leaders have got to be legitimate in the first instance by ensuring a free, fair elections through a free media and the rule of law, etc. Okay, one. Secondly, this notion, to my mind, is flawed because they say that this is based on teachings of Confucius. Because Confucius talks about, refer to the issue of filial piety, respect for elders and respect for authority. But what about, what if? I mean, I believe that is taken out of context. When Confucius talks about Ta'aran, I mean, the wise, big, great man is what? Is the strength of his conscience, or his virtue, his incorruptibility, his expression, his right to express frankly. Why is this ignored? I quite disagree. In fact, I learned Confucius more from a Harvard professor, Tu Wei Ming, than most others. You see, Harvard is I've never studied in Harvard, but I can assure you I follow quite a bit of Harvard. Oh, you're from MIT, okay then. So we do make these blunders, from time to time. Well, MIT I use for the management courses.
Good evening, Dr. Anwar. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm a freshman from Harvard College. I'm from Singapore, and I wonder if you've made the acquaintance of Dr. Chee Soon Juan, whom I see as your Singaporean counterpart in fighting for democracy and human rights. And he's mentioned before that one crucial aspect of this fight is getting enough people interested in human rights and democracy to convince people in Southeast Asia that it's not just the economy, stupid, if I may put it that way. So I'm just interested in asking, what solutions do you see to this problem in the long run? I mean, in getting young people out of their apathy.
I asked a very senior leader in this administration in Washington. I said, why are you so tolerant of all these excesses in many countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia? The reply was quite frank. He said, look, Anwar, we can't be seen to be fighting with most Muslim countries and most countries. So, Malaysia, Singapore, relatively stable, economically quite vibrant, so we ignore some of these issues. And so I said, where is the consistency? Clearly it's a contradiction. I don't suggest that they go to war against Singapore or Malaysia, but at least consistently take a position. Look, what about free media? The freedom index in Malaysia in terms of media, we are about 150, number 150, which means close to Cuba and Libya and, yeah. But of course, in terms of development, we are much higher, you see. So there is clear democracy deficit, and this is tolerated. And I have great difficulty in comprehending this as a coherent policy. Now, the argument is, look, after all, America takes 10, 15 years after the War of Independence to the formulation of a proper constitution, 150 years before the Brown and Board of Education. So give us some time, particularly the Muslim world. This is very condescending. To my mind, it's an insult to the Muslims. You mean to say we are 200 years behind time? And most countries have been independent for half a century. And we talk about Islam, adl, ihsan, justice, and virtuous, and produce great civilizations of the past. And we don't even understand the notion of freedom and basic freedom and gender equality. We treat our women as slaves. I mean, this is tolerable? No, certainly this is not tolerable to my mind. Thank you.
I'm just going to call people in the order that they...
John Reedy, Shorenstein Media Advisory Council. I just had a question. Is there anything we can learn from France, what is going on there today? The French government's not too popular here anyway, and so there may be a little, sure. And are there any solutions? And can this happen in Germany, England, the United States? Because maybe it's just the French system.
Well, violence, of course, not the answer, and I make it very clear. To my mind, I have... this is certainly deplorable, but I think if we have to learn from the policies of the French authorities, certainly not arrogance. It's clear arrogance. You take a position so not only condescending, but so intolerant. Wearing a scarf is a major issue, and so the Muslims find it difficult to comprehend. You can go half naked in the street, it is tolerable, but you can't put on a scarf in Paris. I would say that, okay, you allow people to decide for themselves. You want to have a basic code, okay, don't walk naked, fair enough, but then otherwise have some, minimum code. But this is clearly seen to be an affront to the Muslims. And then, look at these marginalized groups of immigrants. 40% unemployment and the way they were treated by the authorities. And this is not new. I was in Paris just last few months. I mean, you can find the resentment was so strong even then. And I fail to understand how this very sophisticated, intelligent apparatchiks and apparatus fail to understand and comprehend this. I mean, don't blame the French intelligence. You look at CIA and FBI, you understand too. But we have to learn. You see, I have to qualify this. I do not condone. I think it's very unfortunate. Is again giving a very bad image of the Muslim world. That the Muslims, look, these guys, when they have problems, they resort to violence. But governments have also to understand. Why do you marginalize these groups completely? They are just like not slaves, but close to one. If you understand what I'm talking about, going to these areas, how they're treated, their education, their health, their employment opportunities, the treatment is very, very, it's really, really unfortunate. Thank you.
Good evening, Datuk Seri. No, I'm Malaysian and I'm a student of religion at the Divinity School. My studies have been about the role of ignorance in perpetrating evil. So my question tonight is, you've talked a lot about the stifling of speech, the silencing of speech. So my question is, do you agree that we're becoming much more comfortable with the silencing of speech? And if so, why? Why are we becoming much more comfortable with that?
In Malaysia?
Globally, or if you want to point it back to Malaysia.
Well, I don't believe that people choose to be silent unless they are cowed and they are scared. You see, this is the first, I've been out of prison for a year now. I've been asked to conduct seminars at Oxford and a number of universities. This is the first university, I'm telling you this is the first address that you will find Malaysians having the courage to attend and speak. Because all other places, we have embassy personnel from the Malaysian government working through the intelligence outfit, warning students, don't attend. Okay, don't be seen to be talking to Anwar. You see, because I don't know whether they have, they think that I'm HIV positive or whatever. You see, so this is worrying. They're fair. They have a view against. They feel that they want to defend. Yes, there's media freedom in Malaysia. They have every right to come and defend themselves. You see? So this culture and climate of fear is something very real in many Muslim countries. And this need to be dealt with. I think we need students like you to have some courage, a conviction. Courage and conviction to express your views politely. After all, you're not purveyors of violence, or certainly you don't perpetrate one, but you talk about basic freedom, human dignity. What is life without dignity and honor? Thank you.
Good evening, Datuk. My name is Lisa and I'm from Wellesley College. You mentioned earlier in response to a question that it is the actual tyrants who are responsible for squashing the creative process of democracy. How do you account for the fact that a majority of these tyrants are in Islamic countries?
Well, I would want to count them, but we have Mugabe in Zimbabwe, we have Castro in Cuba, we have many. I don't want to compete who have more. But I would only say this, that Muslim world have to grapple with this problem. Now, I certainly would like to suggest that this is not something which is embedded, inherent in Muslim society, as you have seen. Muslims in India may be a minority, but they participate in the democratic process. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country. It's a democratic country. Free and fair elections, mind you. And you see the media, to an extent, I thought that in assessing the media in Indonesia prior to the elections and the media in the United States prior to the elections, I think to a large extent, the conduct of elections in Indonesia is far I mean, it's certainly better than the conduct of elections in Florida that I know of. Okay, so there are also positive points. I mean, Turkey is moving in the right direction, and I'm very optimistic with the future of Turkey, particularly with the engagement with the European Union. So, and it is also a major country in Europe. I mean, so do not then confine or look at the issue of the Muslim world from the prism or confine to the Arab world. Hopefully, they will change. After all, from the recent study at UNDP, they have identified Djibouti, you know where Djibouti is. Djibouti happens to be a democratic country in the Arab world. So you have one.
Thank you.
We have time for two short questions. If you could please state very succinctly. This gentleman and the lady up there.
Sure. Dr. Anwar, thank you for addressing us today. My name is Ashraf Haq. I'm from the Harvard School of Business, the first year. You talked a lot about these South Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, and how there's a democratic deficit, but they have significant elements of democracy. Just curious, what's your assessment of like Saudi Arabia or some Middle Eastern countries that are very public or very visible Islamic countries, and how are they going to go along this path towards democracy? Thanks.
Firstly, I cannot accept that Saudi Arabia is visible Islamic country compared to, say, Indonesia or Turkey. To me, a Muslim country is a Muslim country by virtue of the majority of the population become Muslims. It's not what the professed claim to be Islamic or not. And Saudi Arabia, of course, one country that requires reform, gender equality, participatory democracy, and I believe it has to happen. Thank you.
My name is Nadia, and I'm an undergraduate in the college. My question is, do you believe that the separation of religion and state is necessary for democracy? And if you do agree, then how do you reconcile this with Islam, which views itself as a religion, as a way of life? And you gave example of Turkey, and I believe that Turkey, as seen in the Muslim world, is viewed as a country that is trying to reject its Muslim identity, and in fact that Turkey has a very strong tradition of secularism, the separation of religion and state. And also comment on countries like Afghanistan and Iran, where I think most people what people object to in that countries is the involvement of the religious authorities in the central governing system.
Now, let me begin with Turkey. Yes, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk tried to completely secularize Turkey. I don't think he was successful. The present generation wants to bring back some of its roots, which means that it is a modern, constitutional democracy, not completely secular in that context, because Mustafa Kemal was just not secular, he was anti-religion, mind you. You can have an azan, a prayer call in Arabic. It's forbidden. Yeah. You can have even some Islamic instructions in schools. It's forbidden. But that was his view. But Turkey is moving, finding its moderate roots, which means it's not at war against Islam, but at the same time, it wants to establish itself as a modern, democratic country. Well, it claims itself under constitutional framework as secular, but certainly not extreme secularism as seen under Mustafa Kemal. Now, how do you then separate religion and state? You talk about Afghanistan and Iran with the mullah rule, the mullah government. I believe that the mullahs or the clerics have a right to espouse their views, but they do not have the sole monopoly to decide the rule and the law. Why I dispute and even critical of some portion of the constitutional provisions in these countries, and even now the new Iraqi constitution, is that gray area of the possibility of, in a dispute, to refer to religious authority for final decision. Fair enough, how to pray, how to, some religious duties, I'll refer to religious authority. But in terms of governance, you have to refer to the representative of the people. It has to be parliament or a referendum. So I would then question, this is a constitution that is supported by the American administration. I fail to understand. But probably the explanation is that it's not, my interpretation may not be right. But we must respect the right and do not demonize the ulama or the clerics. This is the problem with the secularists. They take the extreme. I don't. They want to espouse, they espouse. Even Muslims. In Malaysia, you want to espouse Islamic State, you can espouse. I have no qualms about it. I'm a liberal, I'm a Democrat. But I'm a Democrat, you can't talk about Islam. That's what I've heard. A Democrat, but you can't talk about it. No. But you must accept certain constitutional guarantees. Freedom of religion, freedom of worship, free media, rule of law. And this is sacrosanct. You can't touch them. Because if you do, then the entire framework of a contract, social contract, would fall apart. When things fall apart, then you will have civil strife. But you must allow. In Indonesia, in the elections, mind you, parties, Islamic parties, calling for Islamic state and governance, application of Islamic law and the Sharia, were allowed to contest in the elections. Of course, they lost very badly in the elections. Now, the question is, somebody asked, what if they won? What happened? They would have won, but the constitutional provision would allow them to maneuver to an extent that is allowable, not beyond that. So this institution of civil society is important, because people used to give the example, set an example of FIS, FIS in Algeria. But to my mind, and from my limited experience in Malaysia, talking about the coalition of the opposition, including the Islamic Party, I say yes, but we make it very clear. Islamic State is not in the agenda. But the constitutional provision and guarantees must be made very clear. You want to have an Islamic party, Christian party, Buddhist party, Hindu party, you can have. But the constitutional provision must be agreed upon. That is issues enshrined in the Constitution, that in no way can you amend them. These are like the Bill of Rights in the United States experience. There are things that we can learn in the United States. We shouldn't be anti them all the way. So, now, how do you then separate religion and state? Well, I don't want to be involved in this discourse, particularly when the perception of and the understanding of what secularism entails. That has got to be defined. If by secularism you mean you are not anti-religion, you respect the right of every religion to practice, but not to compel others to do it, I am for that. But my personal view, I choose not to use the term secularism because it emanates from a particular Western experience, the Pope and the Emperor, and the division between church and state, which is a peculiar experience. But in, I think, the Muslim world, it is also dangerous. You take an extreme view promoting secularism because you will alienate to a large extent the vast majority of the Muslim population who fear the experience of what happened in Turkey under Kemal, which they see, they perceive as anti-Islam. So to my mind, it is better to spell out what we want. And after spelling it out, constitutional provision guarantee, you call it secular, by all means do so. Or you call it Muslim, it's okay. But the problem with us now, as you see in many of these narratives and discourses and polemics, here even, is that, it's just branding, the jihadis, the Wahhabis, and you alienate people by the thousands. I'm not saying that I'm for jihadis, but you have to explain. Or Islamists, Islamic Party, fundamentalists. So you have all these terms, and it has lends legitimacy. And the moment you are an Islamist, you have had it. So I'm very worried to be termed as an Islamist. Because then immediate perception of a prejudice against these groups. So to my mind, it's better to define. The failure of many of the so-called fundamentalist Islamists is that they fail to define. They talk about, we want Islamic State, we want Islamic government. They never define. So this has caused so much fear. And in my engagement with many of these Islamists or Islamic movements, I tell them, frankly, from my limited experience in Malaysia, not only non-Muslims fearful, I'm genuinely fearful of this notion of Islamic State or Islamic governance, but even many Muslims, half the Muslims that I know of are fearful because they see the extreme version of the Islamist rule, like the Taliban, the way they denigrate their own women, the way they apply the Islamic laws without any due process and due consideration and understanding of socioeconomic factors, which is clearly there even under Islamic law or Sharia. So it's the failure to comprehend the religion, the obsolete understanding, the truncated view of Islam, which is now questioned by Muslims and Muslim scholars themselves. Thank you.
I'm sorry, we have to call it close to the proceedings. We're already out of time. It's a privilege to listen to someone of the courage and conviction of Anwar, who's not only in short supply in Southeast Asia and South Asia, but in the world anywhere. So thank you very much, Datuk Seri, and thank you for coming to Harvard.
Yeah.